In the spring of 1887, on a flat stretch of the Bitterroot Valley in western Montana Territory, a girl of 20 stood at the back of a clerk's office and counted out $3 in coin she had earned hauling water, and with that money, she bought a thing no one else in the room would have taken as a gift. The clerk did not look up when he wrote the receipt. He had been selling off the bones of the old Carver Freight Company for a week, and he had grown bored of telling people that the lots were worthless. The girl's name was Della Cobb, and she had slept 3 nights running in the loft of a livery stable, and she had nothing in the world but a hammer with a hickory handle, worn pale at the grip, and the memory of a dead man who had taught her how to read a floor. What she bought was an abandoned way station on the road south of Stevensville, a low building of squared timber, with a great iron scale set into its floor, the kind that had once weighed ore wagons and freight teams and charged a toll by the hundredweight. The company had failed 2 winters before the road had gone quiet. The men in the office laughed when she laid her coins down, because a way station that weighed nothing was a joke, and a homeless girl who paid for one was a better joke still. She let them laugh. She had learned long ago that a person who is being laughed at is a person who is not being watched, and she had reasons of her own for wanting to be left alone with that floor. You may think you know already what a thing like that is worth. Stay with the girl a while and watch what her hands find under the iron. The valley had buried more than one secret under the weight of its own indifference, and this was the season it gave one back. Della had not always been alone. She had been raised, after a fashion, by a man named Tobias Hale, a scale maker and a fitter of weights, who had come west to service the freight roads when the mines were young and the wagons ran day and night. He was not her father by blood. He had found her at 9 years old, half-starved at the edge of a mining camp where her own people had died of the fever, and he had kept her because, he said, a child who watched as carefully as she did ought to be put to some use. For 11 years she had been his apprentice and his shadow. She had learned the trade of weights from the inside, the way a person learns a language by living in it rather than by studying it. A scale, Tobias told her, is an argument made of iron. Every honest scale tells the truth, and every dishonest scale tells a lie so smoothly that no one thinks to check it. He taught her that the lie was almost never in the beam, where a man might think to look, but in the foundation, in the lever pits below the floor, where the weight was carried and divided long before it ever reached the dial. Watch the floor, he told her. The beam is where they argue. The floor is where they hide the body. She did not understand him fully when she was 12. She understood him completely by the time she was 20, and by then he was 3 months dead of a chest sickness that no amount of careful watching could weigh or correct. She remembered the lessons as a sequence of cold mornings in borrowed sheds along the freight roads, her teacher on his knees in a lever pit with a candle stub stuck to a stone, and his big spectacled face an inch from a knife edge, naming each part aloud so the child crouched beside him would carry the names away. The main lever, the transfer lever, the connecting rod and the loop and the long steel ribbon of the stay. He made her recite them until she could find each by touch in the dark, because a fitter, he said, often works where no light will reach, and a fitter who needs to see is a fitter who is useless half the time. He made her learn the sound a true bearing made when the weight came onto it, a clean settling, and the sound a worn one made a faint grinding complaint, so that she could hear a fault before she ever saw it. By 14, she could level a beam blind. By 17, she could tell, from the way a wagon's weight came up on the dial, whether the man who built the scale had been honest or clever, and she had learned that the clever ones were far more common than the valley liked to believe. He had left her almost nothing. A scale maker who works for other men dies with other men's money in other men's pockets. He left her the hammer and a folding rule and a set of fitter's wrenches wrapped in oiled cloth, and he left her the knowledge in her hands which the law did not recognize as property and which no creditor could seize. When the livery owner told her she could not sleep in his loft past the week, She went looking not for charity but for a floor she could read, because a floor was the one thing in the world she knew better than anyone who might try to cheat her of it. The Carver Way station had been built in the year 1879, when the freight road through the Bitterroot carried ore down from the western claims to the smelter sidings near the river. Every loaded wagon that passed had to stop and be weighed, and the toll was reckoned by the hundredweight, and the company grew fat on the difference between what it charged and what it owed. Della had heard the stories the way everyone in the valley had heard them, as grumbling without proof. The freighters had always said the Carver scale ran heavy, that a wagon weighed there came up 40 or 50 pounds above its true burden every single time, and that over the years the company had skimmed a fortune in tolls from men who had no scale of their own to argue with. The freighters had said it for years. No one had ever proved it, because the only scale that could have settled the question was the very scale that was accused, and a thing cannot testify against itself, or so the valley believed. Tobias had believed otherwise. In his last winter, with the cough rattling him and his hands gone too unsteady to fit a weight, he had spoken of the Carver scale more than once, as a man speaks of a problem he had meant to solve and run out of time for. He had serviced scales up and down that road in the early years, before the Carver Company brought in its own fitter and shut the independents out. He told Della there had been something wrong with the way the Carver pit was built. He had seen the excavation once, in '79, and the lever pit had been dug deeper and longer than the mechanism required, and he had asked the company's man about it and been told to mind his own trade. A pit dug bigger than its purpose, Tobias said, is a pit dug for two purposes. He never learned the second one. He died wondering, and he passed the wondering to her like a coin pressed into a palm. So when the clerk read out the lots of the failed company and named the way station at $3 with no bidders and no interest, Della understood that she was not buying a ruined building. She was buying her way down into the floor that her teacher had died curious about, and she was the one person alive who had the skill to open it and the reason to look. She moved into the station the same afternoon. It was a poor shelter, the roof sound, but the windows broken. The great scale platform sunk into the center of the floor under a skin of dust and mouse dirt and the chaff of 2 abandoned winters. She swept it by lantern light, working from the walls inward the way one cleans a thing one means to understand, and not merely tidy, and as the broom uncovered the deck, she read the boards as she went, noting which were sound and which had begun to rot at the ends, which were original and which had been replaced. Because a floor tells its history to a person who knows how to ask. She found the dial first, a tall cast-iron face with the Carver name in raised letters. The needle, frozen, had a weight that meant nothing now. She cleaned it the way Tobias had taught her, with oil and a soft rag and patience, easing the grime out of the lettering with a sliver of pine wood whittled to a point, and she felt the old machine want to move under her hands, the bearings stiff but not ruined. Whoever had abandoned the place had not destroyed the scale, they had simply walked away from it, as a man walks away from a tool he no longer needs, and does not imagine anyone else will ever want. That first night she did not sleep, so much as lie in the dark listening to the building settle, and thinking about what her teacher had said. The beam is where they argue, the floor is where they hide the body. In the morning, with the cold light coming through the broken glass, she began to take the floor apart. The platform of a wagon scale is a deck of heavy planks laid over a frame, and beneath the frame is the pit, and in the pit are the levers, the long iron arms that gather the weight of the load at many points, and concentrate it step by step down to a single small force that the beam can balance against a known counterweight. It is an elegant thing when it is honest. Della knew every part of it. She knew where the planks were pinned and how to lift them without splitting the wood, and she worked all that first morning prying up the deck, one board at a time, and stacking the boards against the wall until the iron skeleton of the mechanism lay open to the air for the first time in 8 years. What she saw stopped her hands. The lever system was ordinary. The main levers ran where they should, the knife edges seated in their bearings, the whole apparatus exactly as 100 other scales she had helped her teacher build and mend. The pit that held them, though, was wrong, just as Tobias had said. It was too large. The masonry walls of the excavation stood a full 4 feet beyond where the mechanism ended, and the floor of the pit on the far side was not the packed earth and gravel she expected, but a course of dressed stone, fitted and mortared, a deliberate surface where no surface was needed. A lever pit needs only enough room to swing its arms. This pit had a room behind the room. She had seen the body, in the sense her teacher meant. She had not yet seen what the body was. She did not rush. Tobias had taught her that haste in this trade was how a fitter lost fingers and how a careless man missed the one detail that mattered. She spent the rest of that day simply looking, with the lantern lowered into the pit on a cord, mapping with her eyes what she would have to undo with her hands. The dressed stone floor met the masonry wall at a seam too clean to be accidental. In the corner, half hidden behind the nearest lever arm, was a square of iron set flush into the stone, a plate perhaps 2 feet on a side, with no handle and no obvious hinge, only 4 heavy bolts at its corners, their heads painted over with the same dull tar that coated the iron of the mechanism, so that at a glance the plate vanished into the machine. A man who wanted a thing never found does not put a handle on it. Della knew that. She also knew that 4 bolts are an argument that can be won with patience, and she had inherited from her teacher both the wrenches that fit them and the temper that could turn them without stripping the heads. The light was going, though, and her arms ached from the planks, and she had learned that the floor would still be there in the morning. She traced the seam once more with her thumb, feeling where the mortar had been worked smooth by a careful hand, and she marked in her memory the order in which she would loosen the bolts, the way her teacher had taught her to plan a job before she touched it, so that the work would go in one direction only and never need undoing. A fitter who improvises, Tobias had said, is a fitter who is about to break something he cannot mend. She climbed out of the pit, ate the last of the bread she had carried from town, and slept on the board she had stacked, with the hammer in its place beside her hand, the way it had lain beside her every night, since the man who gave it to her had died. In the days that followed, the town began to notice her. A homeless girl who buys a worthless building is a curiosity for an afternoon. A girl who stays, who is seen carrying lamp oil and bread out the South Road, and is not seen coming back to beg, becomes something the town must form an opinion about. The opinions were not kind. There was a freight agent named Royal, a heavy, comfortable man, who had bought up the better lots of the Carver Company at the same sale, the warehouses and the good wagons and the road contracts, everything of value, and who regarded the way station as the one piece of refuse he had been glad to let go. He rode out the South Road on the 3rd day, ostensibly to look at a culvert, and he reined up at the station and looked at the girl through the open door with the expression of a man inspecting a stain. He asked her what she thought she was doing. She told him she was cleaning a scale. He laughed, the same laugh she had heard in the clerk's office, and he told her the scale had not weighed a wagon in 2 years and would not weigh one again, that the road was dead and the company was dead, and she had thrown away $3 she plainly could not spare. Then he said a thing that she kept the way she kept, every loose detail filed against the day it might fit. He said she ought to leave the floor alone and find honest work. He had not seen the floor. He could not have seen the floor from the door with the deck stacked against the wall and the pit in shadow. And yet he had said the floor. And a man who warns you away from a thing he should not know about has told you the thing is worth finding. Della said nothing about that. She thanked him for his concern in a voice with no warmth in it, and she went back to work. And she felt his eyes on her back until his horse carried him away up the road. That night she thought about Royal for a long time. He had bought everything the Carver Company owned that had value. He had been with the company a long time, the town said, since the early years. The clerk at the sale had called him the company's own man once before catching himself, as though Royal's name and the company's were so tangled in the old days that a person could hardly speak the one without the other. If the carver scale had run heavy for 8 years and skimmed a fortune in false tolls, the money had gone somewhere, and the men who took it had names, and one of those names might be sitting comfortable now on the best lots of the very company that had done the skimming. She did not let herself leap to the conclusion. Her teacher had warned her against the satisfying answer arrived at too quickly, which was its own kind of dishonest scale. She filed the thought and waited for the floor to confirm it or deny it, because the floor did not care what she suspected, and the floor was the only witness she trusted. What she did not yet know was that the floor would answer the question more completely than she had dared to hope, and that the answer had been waiting in the dark under the iron for longer than she had been alive. She went down into the pit the next morning with the wrenches. The bolts were stubborn with rust and tar, and the first one cost her an hour and the skin of 2 knuckles. But she had penetrating oil, and she had time, and she had the particular patience that comes to a person who has nothing else to do and nowhere else to be. She worked the oil into the threads and let it sit, and worked it again. She wrapped a strip of sacking around the wrench handle so the steel would not chew her palm, and she set the jaws square on the bolt head and tested the angle twice before she put her weight on it, because a wrench that slips on a rusted head ruins the head and ends the job. She braced her feet against the masonry and put her weight on the long wrench her teacher had forged, slow and even, leaning into it the way he had taught her, not with a jerk that would shear the iron, but with a steady, growing force that gave the rust time to let go. She felt the first bolt give with a groan that seemed to come up out of the ground itself. The second came easier. The third fought her, the head half-rounded, and she had to file 2 flats onto it to take the wrench at all an hour's work for a quarter turn, and she did the work without complaint, because complaint had never loosened anything. The fourth she had learned the trick of by then, and it came in its turn, and she lifted the iron plate out of its seat and set it aside, and the dark under it breathed up at her cold air that had been sealed away from the valley for 8 years. She lowered the lantern on its cord. Below the plate was a chamber, a stone-lined box, perhaps 3 feet deep, and as wide as the plate, dry as a bone, and in it, neatly stacked, were ledgers. Not one. A dozen of them, bound in cracked leather, their spines stamped with the years and faded gilt, 79 through 85. Beside the ledgers stood a strong box of black iron, and laid across the top of the strong box, wrapped in waxed paper gone brittle with age, was a single bound book smaller than the rest, and a folded paper sealed with a wafer of red wax. Della knelt at the lip of the chamber for a long while and did not touch any of it. She understood that she was looking at the second purpose of the pit, the one her teacher had wondered about until he died. A man does not bury his honest accounts under a scale floor behind a tarred iron plate. He buries the books that would hang him. The valley had been right for 8 years and had never been able to prove it, and the proof had been here the whole time, sealed under the very floor where the lie was told, because the safest place to hide the record of a crime is inside the machine that commits it. She lifted the topmost ledger out into the light, and she opened it, and she began, slowly, to read. The hand was clerkly and precise. Each page recorded a day's weighings, wagon by wagon, the freighter's name, the declared load, the weighed load, the toll. Della read down the columns and at first saw nothing but the ordinary commerce of a freight road. Then she saw it, because she had been taught to see it. The weighed load was always higher than the declared load by 40 pounds, by 50, by 60, never the same figure twice, but always in the same direction, always heavier, never once lighter. A scale that erred honestly would err in both directions, sometimes high and sometimes low, scattered like the fall of dice. This scale erred only one way. It was the signature of a rigged beam as plain to her as a man's handwriting, and the ledger recorded it day after day, season after season, for years, in the company's own careful hand. The rigged weighings, though, were only the half of it. The smaller book, the one wrapped in waxed paper, was not a ledger of weighings at all. It was a private account, a second set of books kept by a single man, and it recorded where the skim had gone. Each month the false tolls were totaled, and the surplus, the money taken above the honest toll, was divided, and the divisions were written out with initials beside them. Most of the money went to the company. A steady portion, though, month after month, went to a set of initials that Della did not at first understand, until she reached the final pages and found, in a fit of carelessness or pride, a single full name written out where the initials had stood. The name was Marcus Royal, the freight agent, the comfortable man on the best lots, the man who had ridden out to tell a homeless girl to leave the floor alone. Della closed the book. She sat in the cold breath of the chamber, with the lantern throwing her shadow up the masonry wall, and she felt no triumph, only the grave weight of a thing finally understood. Her teacher had died wondering. She was not wondering any more. She did not run to town with the books. A person who has been laughed at and warned off does not win by shouting. She had been taught that evidence kept its power only so long as it could not be taken or burned, and she understood at once that the most dangerous moment was the one she was now in. The moment between finding the proof and putting it somewhere it could not be made to vanish. Royal had warned her away from the floor. Royal would not leave the floor alone forever. She had perhaps days, not weeks. So she did what her teacher would have done. She made it permanent before she made it public. She copied. By lantern light, over 2 long nights, she transcribed the private account in her own hand onto fresh paper, every total, every division, every initial, and the full name where it appeared. And she did the same for the most damning pages of the weighing ledgers, the ones that showed the one-way error plainest. She made 2 copies of everything. She wrapped the originals again in their waxed paper, and returned them to the chamber, and set the iron plate back over them, and turned the 4 bolts down finger-tight, so that to a careless eye the floor looked as it had, undisturbed. The body was back in its grave. She had its likeness now, though, twice over, and she carried 1 copy on her person and hid the second where no one would think to dig. On the 5th day she walked back into Stevensville with the copy folded against her ribs, and she did not go to the sheriff, because the sheriff was a carver appointment from the old days, and she did not know which way he would lean. She went instead to the one person the books had named as a victim and not a thief. Among the freighters whose names ran down the rigged columns, one appeared more often than any other, a man named Eli Stroud, who had hauled ore on that road for 6 years and been weighed heavy 600 times. Stroud was old now, his hauling days behind him, living on the charity of a married daughter at the edge of town, a weathered man with a freighter's ruined hands and a freighter's long memory. Della had asked after him quietly. She found him on his daughter's porch, mending harness he no longer had a team to pull, working a length of cracked leather between fingers swollen at every joint, and she sat down on the step uninvited, the way her teacher had taught her to sit with a man whose help you wanted as an equal and not a supplicant. And she showed him the columns with his own name in them. He squinted at the page a long moment, holding it at arm's length and then close, and she saw him reading his own name down the years, the dates of haulings. He had half forgotten the loads he had sworn over. He was slow to understand, and then he understood all at once, and the cracked leather slid out of his hands and lay forgotten on the boards. He had always known the carver's scale ran heavy. Every freighter had known. They had argued it for years over their own helpless certainty, around campfires and in the back rooms of the saloons, and the company had always answered that the scale was inspected and sealed and beyond question, and a man who could not afford his own certified scale had no standing to dispute the one the law recognized. Stroud had paid those tolls because he had no choice, and he had watched the difference between the honest weight and the company's weight come out of his own thin living year after year, 40 pounds at a time, 50 pounds at a time, a few coins a wagon that added across a working life to a house he never bought and a team he had to sell. He had grown old believing the theft and never able to name it. Now a girl of 20 sat on his step and laid the proof in his ruined hands, in the company's own writing, with the surplus divided and a name attached. He wept, which she had not expected, and she sat with him while he did it, and did not look away and did not hurry him. When he was done, he asked her what she wanted of him. She told him the truth. She wanted a witness the valley would believe, an old freighter whose word about that road carried weight no homeless girl's word ever could, and she wanted his memory. The names of the other men weighed heavy, so that what had been taken could be reckoned and, so far as the strongbox allowed, returned. The strongbox. She had not yet opened it. She had judged the books the more urgent thing, and the box the more dangerous, because a box of money is a temptation, and a provocation both, and she had wanted a witness beside her when she broke it open, so that no one could ever say she had taken from it in the dark. Now she had her witness. They went out the south road together the next morning, the old man riding in a borrowed cart because his legs would not carry him so far, and the girl walking beside the wheel with the hammer in her hand. The strongbox was locked and the key was long gone, but a lock is only another argument made of iron, and Della had opened more stubborn ones in her apprenticeship. She did not force it crudely. She worked the mechanism with a pick filed from a length of wire, patient as ever, while Eli Stroud held the lantern and watched with the held breath of a man at a graveside, and after the better part of an hour the lock turned and the lid came up. The box held money, but not the fortune the Valley's stories had promised. It held a little over $1,100 in mixed coin and notes, the last skim of the last season before the company failed, never distributed because the failure had come faster than the thieves expected, sealed away with the books to be retrieved when the noise died down. $1,100 was a great deal of money to a girl who had paid $3 for a floor. It was nothing beside what 8 years of false tolls had taken from the men whose names filled the ledgers. Della looked at it a long moment, and Eli Stroud looked at her. And what she did next was the thing that decided everything that came after. She closed the box. She told the old man that the money was not hers and not his, that it belonged to the men it had been stolen from in the proportions the ledgers themselves recorded, and that she meant to see it returned to them or to their widows and children down to the last coin she could trace. Stroud argued with her. He said she had found it, that she had nothing, that the men would never know if she kept a fair share for her labor. She said that she would know, and that her teacher would have known, and that a thing returned crookedly was no better than the thing stolen. She had not opened the floor to become the next person who took from it. That, more than the proof itself, was what turned the Valley. Word of the books went out the way such things go, faster than any rider, and within a week the whole Valley knew that the homeless girl on the South Road had found the Carver Company's hidden ledgers under the way station floor, and proven what the freighters had sworn for years. It was the other word, though, the word that she had refused the money and meant to give it back, that did the work no proof alone could have done. A girl who finds a fortune and keeps it is a lucky thief. A girl who finds a fortune and returns it is something the Valley did not have a ready name for, and people came out the South Road to see her, not to laugh now, but to look, and the looking had changed. Marcus Royal did not come. Della had wondered whether he would ride out to threaten her or to plead with her, and he did neither, because a man whose name is written in his own crime's ledger has nothing left to say to the person who holds it. The copies were already beyond his reach, one in the hands of a lawyer in Missoula whom Eli Stroud's daughter had named as honest, the other still hidden where Della had put it. There was no floor he could dig up, no fire he could set, that would call the proof back into the dark. The thing that had protected the secret for 8 years, its perfect concealment, had become the thing that doomed him the moment it was concealed no longer. He sold his good lots within the month, below their worth, to men who no longer wished to be seen dealing with him, and he left the valley before the first snow, and the road did not ask where he went. He was not defeated in any scene that anyone witnessed. He simply became a man no one would stand next to, and then he was gone, undone not by a confrontation, but by the weight of what had been written under the iron in his own account. The reckoning took the better part of a year. Della and Eli Stroud and the Missoula lawyer worked through the ledgers wagon by wagon, name by name, reckoning what each man had been overcharged across the years, the books recorded, and the $1,100 was paid out in the proportions the theft had taken it, not as charity and not as a windfall, but as a debt repaid. It did not make the freighters whole. 8 years of skimming was a deeper hole than one season's skim could fill. It named the wrong, though, and it returned what could be returned, and it did both in the open, where the whole valley could see that the thing had been done straight. For many of the men, the naming mattered more than the money. They had spent years being told they were wrong, that the scale was honest and their certainty was sour grapes, and now the company's own hand had confessed, in faded guilt, that they had been right all along. There is a particular dignity in being proven right after long doubt, and Della had handed it back to them along with their coins. Eli Stroud did not live to see the reckoning finished. He died in the autumn in his daughter's house, an old freighter who had been weighed heavy 600 times and had lived just long enough to see it set down in writing, that the scale had lied and he had not. Della sat with the family at the burying. She had known him 5 months. She grieved him the way she still grieved her teacher, quietly and without display, as a person grieves the few who saw them clearly. He had left her, in his will, the borrowed cart he had finally bought outright, and a note in his ruined hand that said only that she had given an old man back his good name, and that there was no debt in the world heavier than that one or more fully paid. She kept the way station. It surprised the valley that she would, but the valley had stopped being surprised by her. She did not reopen it as a toll house. The road was still dead, and she had no wish to charge anyone for anything. Instead, she did the one thing the floor had taught her she was good at, which was to make iron tell the truth. She set up as an independent fitter and adjuster of scales, the trade her teacher had been driven out of by the very company whose crime she had uncovered, and she went up and down the valley, certifying weights and beams and balances, the only person for 100 miles whose word on a scale no one would dispute, because everyone knew what she had found under her own floor and what she had done about it. She kept her teacher's tools oiled and laid out in the order he had kept them, the folding rule and the fitter's wrenches in their oiled cloth, and she added to them slowly as the work came in, a new file, a finer set of test weights stamped and certified, the modest accumulation of a person making an honest living with her hands. The merchants who had laughed at her $3 purchase brought her their scales to certify and paid her fairly, and if any of them remembered laughing, they had the grace not to say so, and she had the grace not to remind them. She charged the same to a poor man as to a rich one, and she told any who asked that a scale which lied to a freighter would lie to a banker just as readily, and that the only protection against a crooked weight was an honest eye that knew where to look, which was a thing she could teach but could not sell. She rebuilt the floor of the station, but she did not seal the chamber. She left the iron plate loose and the dressed stone box empty and open, a small dark room under the deck where a crime had once been buried, and she showed it to anyone who asked. She kept the original ledgers there, in the place they had been hidden, but unsealed now and open to any honest eye, because a thing hidden had done 8 years of harm and a thing shown could do none. The pit that had been dug for 2 purposes now had a third, which was to remember. On a clear evening late in that first year, with the work of the reckoning all but finished and the valley gone gold with the turning of the season, Della Cobb sat on the deck of the scale she had bought for $3 and oiled the dial of the great iron face by the last of the light. The needle moved freely now under her cloth, true in both directions, honest as the day it was cast. Beside her on the boards lay the hammer, with the hickory handle worn pale. At the grip, the one thing her teacher had left her that the law would recognize as property, though it was the least of what he had given her. She had come to this floor with $3 and a dead man's tools and the memory of a thing he had wondered about until it killed his curiosity if not his cough. She had opened the floor, he could not, and read the body. He had only suspected, and she had made the iron tell the truth at last. She set the cloth down and laid her hand flat on the cold face of the scale, the way a person rests a hand on the shoulder of someone they have finally understood. The light went amber, then gray. Somewhere up the road a wagon passed, weighing nothing, owing nothing, free. And Della sat with her hand on the honest iron until the dark came down over the valley and the floor beneath her held nothing but what it had always been built to hold, which was the simple, terrible, ordinary truth. What would you have done if the money had been yours to keep and no one in the world would have known? Sit with that a while. And if a story of a thing the world threw away, holding the proof that set it right, is the kind of story you want more of, there are others like it waiting down the road.